Bush was not focused primarily on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. He was focused much more on the threat posed by Iraq under Saddam Hussein to Kuwait and the need to evict Hussein and Iraq from Kuwait, which he did spectacularly well. And it might be useful to remember these days that even Syria participated in that war on our side. After which, there was some movement towards peace, the Oslo Conference and all of that. And Shamir then jumped in and announced to the Knesset that he's going to get $10 billion from the United States, which is going to be spent in this or that fashion and is going to be therefore in the budget. And he informed Bush of the fact that he's going to get $10 billion from us. And Bush was outraged and wanted particularly some commitment from Shamir regarding the peace process, with the end result being that he withheld the money and there was really no breakthrough on the negotiating process until Clinton attempted it, unfortunately, at the very end of his 8-year-long presidency. For about 10 or 12 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States had a unique historical opportunity to reshape world affairs. And that included dealing with the problem in the Middle East, but not only with it, to construct a stable Europe, enlarged Europe, to set in motion a process that would have a suction effect on Russia, to begin to address the Chinese issue, and so forth. And in my view, that opportunity was forsaken by the irresponsible and fallaciously justified war with Iran shortly after the turn of the century, when President George Bush II decided to invade Iraq. You're correct. When he decided to invade Iraq on the spurious grounds that there was something called weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein allegedly had, with strong hints that this means atomic weapons, and not just chemical weapons, which were included in the category almost as if to justify the argument that we are telling the truth. But the public projection of that assertion was best summarized by the Secretary of State under Bush II, who spoke about the mushroom cloud appearing over the United States if we didn't act. So that was not a reference to chemical weapons. That was a reference to nuclear weapons, which he did not have. And I think that, in effect, set in motion a delegitimization of American global leadership, especially since the consequence of the war in Iraq was not only the removal of Saddam Hussein, which one can claim in a sense was positive, but the destruction of Iraqi society, the killing, I repeat, the killing, I repeat again, the killing of probably more than 100,000 Iraqis in the course of the hostilities and subsequently, and a really destruction of what was at that time a society that had the potential for exercising a constructive role in the Middle East. And I think much of the world also began to reevaluate the potential significance of an overly assertive America capable of pushing others around. And today, American standing in the world is far more critically viewed by the world than otherwise would have been the case, and our ability to act decisively is much diminished. And at the same time, the Middle East is much more hostile to us as a whole. The Islamic world is much more in ferment and being mobilized on the basis of fanatical hostility towards the United States as the primary enemy. And that plays to the advantage of those who would like to increase their power vis-a-vis us, Putin particularly. The rise of China's influence in the world to some extent benefits from that reality, although the Chinese are now beginning to realize that it could turn against them. I have talked on a number of occasions with some senior Chinese leaders, and they're beginning to talk now of what will happen after you leave Afghanistan, which way will the violence turn? And they're beginning to realize that there is a problem, and I think this gives us an opportunity, perhaps, of acting together. But all of that together means that our position in the world today is much more complex and requires much more delicate reliance not on force, but on diplomacy and geostrategy in how we tackle the global problems. And I think we're seeing that at work in the conjunction between the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Syrian conflict, and the uncertainties of our relationship with Iran. And my hope is that we'll address it in such a way that we can create a new structure of stability with the help of those who are beginning to realize that if we don't succeed in doing this with their help, it might turn against them too. You know, the war ended with the Soviets defeated and leaving. The West had an opportunity to beef up the non-communist regime and didn't do so. And the Taliban came back, not the original Mujahideen, but the Taliban, a much more fanatical religious group, in the context of a devastated Afghanistan. And it was a purely Afghan issue. But then there was the collision between the United States and the Middle East, particularly Iraq, at the end of the 90s, almost a decade later. And then one of the Saudi participants in the original war, namely Osama bin Laden, issued a series of fatwas which were directed specifically at Israel and at the presence of American forces in Saudi Arabia on the grounds that they are, in effect, a sacrilegious alien presence. And that was the launch of Al-Qaeda a decade later. So the connection of the two is a little bit strained. We did earn, however, the gratitude of the Muslim world. If we hadn't, we probably would have had it entirely against us, and not, as subsequently became the case, partially against us. I wrote, actually, both in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal within weeks of 9/11 about this problem. And I was concerned then, and I became increasingly concerned in subsequent years, by the tendency of the administration, but also the American public, to adopt a kind of undiscriminating attitude towards jihadist terror. You know, if you ask yourself, what do you mean when you say jihadist terror? What is jihad? Jihad is holy war. Now, we may not share it, but it's a little bit like the Crusades. In other words, the notion that the war is being fought for a noble, even divinely inspired objective. And so we pitted ourselves verbally and in our national reactions into a sort of reaction, into a posture in which it was very easy for more and more people in the Islamic world to assume that this is an American war against Islam, precipitated by Osama bin Laden and the fatwas that involved Israel and our alleged sacrilegious presence in Saudi Arabia. And we played into that. And I think our public at the same time was obviously traumatized, and understandably so, by 9/11. Obviously. But it resulted in, I think, again, an excess. You know, we live in Washington, you and I. Look at all the business offices, law offices in these buildings with these absolutely absurd security arrangements where there are these so-called guards who intercept you and ask you for your name and where you're going. And, you know, they ask you to sign your name on a form before telling you to which floor you ought to go by elevator. As I think I've told once an audience publicly, this annoys me so that several times I've signed it Osama bin Laden. Never once been stopped. But I felt this is kind of an absurdity, which was a sign of a society beset by fear and anxiety. I think it is fair to say that a lot of Arab Americans or Muslim Americans have not been treated fairly by our judicial process in that context. Someday we'll be reviewing, I think, a lot of cases, just as we did this regarding the interned Japanese or the Germans in World War I and so forth. I think all of that helped to create a rather negative image of a terribly rich and powerful society, obsessed by anxiety and increasingly motivated by religious antagonism. It's not a fair criticism, but it is a politically understandable criticism if you look at the world from the outside. I think we distorted particularly the nature of the problem that we confronted after 9/11 and universalized it, and at the same time conveyed a sense of anxiety and fear, which people generally don't respect. It wasn't the same confident America that responded to the challenges of World War II, or even of the Cold War. It was more an anxious, inward-oriented, increasingly prejudiced America that responded. And look what's happened in the movie theaters regarding films about the world. Look at how some people, the criminals, are portrayed. There are subliminal messages here in terms of the beards and everything else that are being used by the movie industry to propagate, maybe not intentionally, but simply in order to make money, an image of a portion of the world that then creates in that other world a reaction against us. I mean, I think it's very tragic and dangerous that not only in Asia or in the Middle East, but increasingly in Africa, the Muslims, in their most extreme form of activity, tend to focus their hatred on the very distant and remote America. I still think that this country has enormous recuperative powers, but that's also to some extent a principle of faith rather than judgment. Just before we undertook this conversation, I came back to Washington from New York. Nothing new about it. I do this quite often on Nutshella. But I didn't have much to do, so I was looking out of the window. And I was sort of struck by the paradox that I was, first of all, in America's only so-called fast train, which was shaking like some sort of absolutely antiquated piece of machinery, noisy, shaking, and slow. The fastest I think we were going was 60 or 75 miles an hour. And there are these fast trains in China, in Japan, in Europe. We can't produce them. And I was looking out of the window. And what I saw on almost the entire trip was pictures of an industrially decayed slums on the edges of the railroad. Small towns and bigger towns, closed down buildings, old factories. So I was saying to myself, well, now, is this a symptom of a serious illness that we're failing to address? Or is this just an epiphenomenon that's marginal to alternative forms of change, like, for example, the new sources of energy and so forth? I think these issues are now being played out in a manner that will give us an answer, because we are now in a world which is much more competitive, not only in Asia, but Europe too. And before too long, it may be other parts of the world as well, in addition to being more in a condition of turmoil. And I think we as a society have to make some basic judgments regarding how we want to define the meaning of the good life in a democratic society in the 21st century. I think that requires a lot of rethinking about the structure of our society and the distribution of benefits and responsibilities within it.